Seraphine Cole had never once looked at the throne and felt anything close to desire. She had seen it up close, of course. Everyone in the Hall of Records had, at one point or another, been required to stand in the royal chamber to witness the signing of some important decree. The throne was enormous, carved from dark stone, inlaid with silver, and placed on a raised platform so that whoever sat in it was always looking down at the rest of the world. The first time Seraphine had seen it, she had thought it looked deeply uncomfortable. That opinion had never changed. She was 24 years old, and she kept the records. That was her entire life, and she did not say that with bitterness. She meant it plainly, the way someone might say they kept bees or kept a garden. It was her work, and she was good at it, and being good at something quietly and carefully was the only kind of achievement she had ever respected. 7 years she had spent in the hall, transcribing laws, cross-referencing old documents, cataloging decisions made by kings and councils, going back 3 centuries. She knew the Founding Accord, the most important legal document in the entire Pack world, better than any living person. She had read it so many times that she could hear her own voice in the words. The 7 Packs of the realm answered to one ruler, Alpha King Calum Voss. He was known for his composure, his sharp intelligence, and his absolute intolerance for disorder. He had been king for 6 years, and in that time, he had expanded trade between the packs, ended 2 long-standing territorial feuds, and tripled the size of the royal library. People respected him. Some feared him. A few adored him. Seraphine had no strong feelings about him at all, which perhaps explained what happened when he walked into the Hall of Records on a cold Tuesday morning, and she did not look up from her desk. He had come to settle a border dispute, accompanied by 4 advisors and a scribe. The hall was quiet. Everyone else had gone still the moment he entered, that particular stillness that forms around powerful people, part reverence and part wariness. Seraphine finished the sentence she was writing, set down her pen, and then looked up. "Good morning," she said, the same way she said it to everyone. His eyes found her immediately. Something passed across his face, not irritation, not the mild surprise of a man unused to being treated like furniture. Something else. Something closer to interest. He dealt with the border dispute in under an hour. The relevant clause in the accord was clear, and she was able to locate the original document and the 2 subsequent amendments within minutes. He thanked her before he left. She nodded and went back to work. 3 weeks later, she received a formal summons to the royal court. The document was written on thick paper, with a gold seal pressed into the wax. It requested her presence that Friday, at the first bell of the afternoon. It said nothing about why. Seraphine read it twice, tucked it into her coat pocket, and told no one. The court was larger than she had imagined. High ceilings, stone columns, dozens of people in formal dress, standing in rows on either side of a long central floor. At the far end, on the throne she found just as uncomfortable looking as before, sat Calum Voss. He was wearing the dark gray coat of his office, no crown, his expression entirely unreadable. She walked forward and stopped at the appropriate distance. He offered her a position. The title was Council of Records, and it was, he explained, an honor extended to very few people in the history of the realm. She would advise the crown on matters of law and documentation. She would attend court sessions. She would have a private office adjacent to the royal chambers. He spoke clearly. He was a good speaker, measured, well-chosen words, no unnecessary weight. She listened to all of it, and as she listened, she read the actual meaning behind the offer, the way she read everything. Carefully, without letting the surface distract her from the structure underneath. The title was impressive. The work was not what the title suggested. She would advise, but her advice would not be binding. She would attend court sessions, but she would sit to the left of the throne, not across from it. The private office was adjacent to the royal chambers, which meant it was also easily monitored. It was a role designed to bring her close while keeping her contained. Not a position of power, a position of appearance. She took a slow breath. "I am grateful," she said, and she meant that part. "But I must decline." The silence in the room was absolute. Not the silence of a crowd that has gone still, the silence of a crowd that has momentarily forgotten how to function. She was aware of eyes on her from all directions. She was aware of a woman near the front of the room, Lady Mira Ashvale. She would learn the name later. whose expression had sharpened into something cold. Calum looked at her for a long moment. "May I ask why?" he said. "Because it is not the role it appears to be," she said, simply and without edge. "I mean no disrespect, my king. You are offering it in good faith. But I read documents carefully, and the terms of this position would place me in proximity to power, without any real access to it. I would rather remain where my work is honest." Another silence. Then she thanked him again, and she left. The consequences arrived within days. Her pack, what was left of it, 3 cousins, and an elderly aunt, who had never quite forgiven her father for the disgrace that had pushed them all to the margins, begged her to reconsider. This had been their chance. One word from the king's court, and the family name would be rehabilitated. She understood. She was sorry. She did not change her mind. Lady Mira Ashvale began telling people that Seraphine had declined out of fear, that she had lost her nerve in the throne room and fled. The story spread. Seraphine heard it, and felt nothing in particular about it. Stories like that required a response to survive, and she had none to give. What she did not anticipate was the king. Calum Voss began appearing at the Hall of Records. Not every day, not even every week, but often enough that it could not be coincidence. He always came with a legitimate reason, a treaty to verify, a historical precedent to confirm, a clause to look up. She helped him each time with the same straightforwardness she brought to everything. He always thanked her. She always nodded. He always seemed, on his way out, to be thinking about something. She did not try to make sense of it. She had work to do. The crisis came in the 43rd week of his 6th year as king. 3 of the 7 packs, the Ashvale pack, the Northern Ridge pack, and the Greymount pack, formally challenged the legitimacy of Calum's rule. Their case rested on a procedural technicality buried in a subclause of the founding accord that most people did not know existed. The clause in question dealt with the proper witnessing of a succession ceremony, and they argued that a specific condition had not been met during Calum's coronation. If their interpretation was correct, his rule could be questioned. If it was not correct, they needed someone with the knowledge to prove it. The elder circle convened immediately. The 7 elders were the oldest and most independent authorities in the realm, appointed for life, answerable to no pack and no king, bound only by the accord itself. Elder Oren, who led the circle, announced a trial of succession, a formal proceeding in which any member of the pack world could step forward and demonstrate a commanding knowledge of the founding accord. The person who demonstrated the deepest understanding would be empowered to arbitrate the dispute. Their interpretation would become law. It was, Seraphine read in the notice, an ancient mechanism. It had only been invoked 4 times in 300 years. The highborn families began studying frantically. Lady Mira hired 3 scholars and shut herself in her family library for 2 weeks. Every pack with ambitions sent their best legal minds to acquire copies of the accord and prepare their representatives. The Hall of Records was open to public access, which had never happened before, and by the second morning, there were people standing in line outside the building before the sun had risen. Seraphine watched all of this and went on doing her work. On the day of the trial, she arrived at the council chamber wearing the same coat she wore to work every day. She sat in the back row and listened as the other candidates presented their knowledge. Some were impressive. Some had clearly memorized large sections of the accord without understanding what the sections meant. Lady Mira spoke for 11 minutes and cited 14 clauses correctly. The room responded with genuine admiration. Then Elder Oren asked her the question that stopped every other candidate. If 2 clauses within the accord appeared to contradict each other, and no amendment had ever addressed the contradiction, which clause held precedence, and how was that precedence determined? Every scholar in the room had a different answer. 3 gave up entirely. Lady Mira said the more recent clause would take precedence, which was the intuitive answer, and also, Seraphine knew, incorrect. She stood up from the back row. No one had expected her to be there. Precedence is not determined by date, she said. She was speaking in a normal voice, the voice she used when she was explaining something to a new archivist. Clause precedence in the accord is determined by the level of consensus required at the time of drafting. A clause that required unanimous agreement from all 7 pack leaders to pass holds higher precedence than one that passed by majority. The relevant indicator is the notation in the right margin, the number of original signatures. Any clause with 7 signatures outranks any clause with 4, regardless of which was written first. The notation system is explained in the appendix, which most copies of the Accord have had removed because it was considered administrative detail. The original copies, which I work with daily, still have it intact. The room was very quiet. Elder Oren looked at her for a long time. Then he asked her another question, then another, then 4 more, each one harder than the last. Questions that had baffled legal scholars for generations. Questions about intent and interpretation, and the history of specific words chosen by specific people who had been dead for 200 years. She answered every one, not quickly, not as though she were performing, but steadily, in plain language, the way she would have explained something to someone sitting across from her at the records desk. When he posed the oldest unsolved paradox in pack law, a clause that seemed to grant and revoke the same right in the same sentence, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The clause is not a paradox. It grants the right to all pack members and revokes it specifically for those holding dual citizenship in a foreign territory. In the original language, those were 2 separate categories. The problem arose when the document was translated, and the distinction between the categories was collapsed into a single sentence. If you look at the original notation, the sentence has 2 margins, one marking it as a rights clause, and one marking it as an exclusion clause. They were always meant to be read separately." Elder Oren was still for a long time. Then he stood. He asked the other elders to withdraw with him, and they did. The doors of the side chamber closed. The room waited in a silence so complete that Seraphine could hear the candles burning. When the elders returned, Elder Oren did not sit. He remained standing, which was unusual. His face was composed but not neutral. Something moved behind his eyes, something old and careful and certain. He explained, to the assembled court and the representatives of all 7 packs, that the founding accord contained a provision that had never once been triggered in 3 centuries of use. It was called the right of true sovereignty. It could only be invoked by the elder circle, and only under specific conditions. When a succession trial had failed to produce a clear arbitrator through standard competition, and when one individual had demonstrated a knowledge of the accord that surpassed all others without seeking advantage from that knowledge. He turned toward her. "Seraphine Cole," he said, "by the unanimous vote of the elder circle, under the authority of the founding accord, we declare you the true queen of the 7 packs." She stood still. The room did not explode into noise. It should have, but it did not. It was as if everyone present understood, in that moment, that the occasion was too significant for noise. She asked one question. She asked whether accepting the title required her to leave her work in the Hall of Records. Elder Oren smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that comes from deep recognition rather than amusement. He told her that the Hall of Records, under the right of true sovereignty, would now answer directly to the crown, which meant it answered to her. She said yes. Across the room, Calum Voss rose from where he had been standing and bowed. Not the formal bow of ceremony, a real one, the kind a person gives when they are not performing respect but actually feeling it. She met his eyes. He held her gaze without flinching, and she understood that something in him had been rearranged. Lady Mira Ashvale stood near the back, and she did not move for a long time. She had come to this room expecting one kind of story, and she was watching a completely different one end. The feeling that moved through her was not comfortable, but it was honest. It was the feeling of recognizing that someone had earned something, fair and clean, without taking anything that was not theirs. Seraphine's first official act as true queen was small and practical, and entirely like her. She issued a directive requiring every future king, elder, and pack leader to read the full original text of the founding accord, including the appendix, before assuming any seat of authority. The copy without the appendix was no longer considered a valid reference document for any legal purpose. The law, after 300 years of being held in the hands of those who controlled access to it, was finally open. She walked home that evening through the same streets she had always walked, her coat over her arm, the last of the daylight catching on the cobblestones. The title was real. The work ahead was real. The crown would come later, and she would wear it the same way she had always worn everything, without drama, without display, with the quiet certainty of a woman who had never needed it to know who she was. She had not wanted the throne. It had, in its own ancient and unhurried way, decided that it wanted her.